How do you go from this to this? Boca Juniors is without doubt one of the biggest clubs in the world. Images of the Bombonera crowd, fervorous with joy or induced with collective rage, are familiar to football fans worldwide. La Doce, Boca's 12th man, their hardest fans in the north stand behind the goal, who don't stop singing, who bring the drums, the trumpets, the flags, the banners, the tirantes, and often the pyrotechnics that light up the sky of La Boca neighborhood on Sunday nights. Even to people on my side of the Atlantic, Boca Juniors is much more than that team in Argentina that Diego Maradona played for. It's the biggest team on the continent that lives football like no other, and the holy grail of football trips that everyone wants to tick off their list. Luckily, I've had the privilege of going plenty of times, having lived in Argentina and working for a club that I've grown to love as if it were the one I grew up watching. Let me show you what it's all about. Growing up watching Rooney, Ronaldo and Tevez smash up the Premier League, it was the latter who sent me on my way to Boca fandom. I would watch highlights of Carlos Tevez return to Boca on YouTube, more or less in 2015, 2016. What kind of player makes the crazy decision to leave the team he had just carried to the Champions League final alongside Pirlo and Pogba to come back to a place where he would earn ridiculously less money? 15th of July, Bombonera packed to the rafters on a winter's night. Wherever you look, no space to be seen in the stands. Fans in the Popular standing section, like sardines, shoulder to shoulder. You physically cannot move. Ball boys and youth players line the exit of the tunnel and await the arrival of an idol on the Bombonera turf. The crowd goes from buoyant to vigorous as the news gets out that Carlitos has finished his press conference deep in the underbelly of the stadium and is off to get changed into the iconic indigo blue kit with the horizontal yellow stripe across the chest. Admittedly, I didn't catch that live, but I've since watched it several times on YouTube. None of the grandeur or the spectacle is lost though. Boca are one of the few clubs in the world whose fans consistently leave you in awe. I was about 15, 3 years into studying Spanish at school, and very interested in how people live football outside of England. Had already been to see matches in France, Italy and Spain. Scrolling through Twitter, I saw an account for a podcast in English about Boca Juniors. And of course, I gave them a follow. They would often get people commenting, asking where you could watch Boca on TV in different countries across the world. At some point, an Argentine fella responded to a comment saying, "Football libre." This is where it all changed. I must be the only British person to have ever used Football libre. At the time, it was the only way I could get access to watch Argentine football live. I managed to get my head around the website. My Spanish wasn't as fluent as it is now. And from there, the late nights, at the time school nights, staying up until often 3 or 4 in the morning watching Boca had begun. It was a type of football I'd never ever seen before. The incredible atmospheres, the hinchadas, the quilombos, wow, I could never look back. Now that I had found my way of catching Boca live, there was no turning back. That wasn't enough. The continuous chat you have with your mates during the week about the last match or the next one coming up, the debate about starting 11s, transfer windows, I found the space for all that where it had begun, on Twitter. First following different accounts that Boca in English interacted with, then following enough that the algorithm would suggest more to me. I slowly but surely got more involved. It just made sense to me. It was a fun way of consolidating my Spanish lessons and also finding a community over 11,000 kilometers away from the club that I had found a sudden but intense interest in. I'm not sure my Twitter timeline has been in English since about 2018. And when I was 18, I made my first trip over to Argentina just a couple months before finishing high school. Of course, one of the first things we did was head to the neighborhood of La Boca and get to see the Bombonera up close. It's the one everyone wants to visit, the top of the bucket list. It doesn't matter where you're from in the world, if you love football, you know what La Bombonera means to the sport, the icons that have played there, the madness that goes on match days. If you're a football fan, you want to be in that special ground at least once for a game. Unfortunately, on that trip, Boca weren't playing at home and I didn't manage to see a game in the flesh. That would have to wait. Moving on to uni, I carried on with Spanish and had the opportunity to do an exchange program and live away from the UK for a year. there were no doubts. On the previous trip to Argentina, I left feeling as if there was so much more to explore, and seeing Boca in person was still pending. Everything fitted once again. I spent 2 terms studying here and realised just why it's the best country in the world, with the best team in the world. The people excellent, the atmosphere brilliant, and the football, everything I could have expected and more. Boca fans do it like no one else, and I got to see Boca in La Bombonera close to 20 times. I always have to remind myself of how many people back home dream of that experience just once in their life, and I was doing it every other week. It was an extreme privilege. 23rd of October, 2022. Boca were 1 point behind Racing going into the final day of the season. They would face Racing's arch rivals from their neighbourhood, Independiente, whilst Racing would face Boca's biggest rivals, River Plate, at home in Avellaneda. Effectively, Boca and Racing were, if not cheering, they were at least quietly hoping their biggest rivals would beat their title rivals. Boca only managed a point at home against Independiente, but it was enough to see them pit Racing to the title, who had pecheado against River. I was only here for a year, and Boca would give me the opportunity to see what it was like with the obelisco full of blue and yellow. I really had a stroke of luck that year. Although I was also here when Argentina won the World Cup, this obviously meant more. Whilst I've fallen in love with this country, I'm obviously not Argentinian. The party that night Boca won was probably the best football experience I've ever had. It's something I'll never forget. Will always take with me wherever I go, and will always be grateful for the luck I had in that summer. It was a life-changing experience, even after going back to live far away on the other side of the world again. I often ask myself, what would life be like without Boca? And honestly, it's not worth thinking about.